In 1943, American bombers were not being destroyed by German fighters. They were being destroyed by their own rules. Every gun was working. Every calculation was correct. Every crew followed the manual exactly as written. And men kept dying. This is the part most history books never explain. The United States believed survival in the air was a math problem. Hit probability, optimal range, controlled fire. So gunners were trained to wait, to hold their fire, to trust the numbers. But while they waited, enemy pilots were already attacking. The fatal mistake wasn't poor aim. It wasn't weak aircraft. It wasn't a lack of courage. It was a hidden assumption that defensive fire only mattered when it could hit something. Combat didn't work that way. In the sky, the side that reacts first loses control. Accuracy means nothing if the enemy decides the moment of attack. By the summer of 1943, this misunderstanding had turned Doctrine into a silent killer. Losses climbed, crews vanished, and the system insisted nothing was wrong. What changed the course of the air war wasn't a new plane or a new weapon. It was the discovery that fear, timing, and human reaction mattered more than probability. Once that truth surfaced, everything else followed. If you stay to the end of this story, you'll understand the hidden reason bomber losses suddenly dropped, and why one broken belief proved more dangerous than any enemy aircraft. You want to understand why thousands of bomber crews were lost, not because of enemy superiority, but because of a rule no one questioned: stay with this story. By 1943, the American bombing campaign over Europe was built on a belief so widely accepted that few ever questioned it. Survival in the air, commanders believed, was a problem that could be solved with mathematics. Every element of bomber defense reflected this assumption. Guns were placed to cover every angle. Ammunition loads were calculated down to the round. And, most importantly, gunners were trained to fire only under very specific conditions. They were taught to wait. The manuals were precise. Open fire only when the attacking fighter reached the optimal engagement distance, between 400 and 600 yards. Any earlier, and the probability of a hit dropped too low to justify wasting ammunition. This rule became doctrine, not a suggestion, not a guideline, a rule, and it made perfect sense on paper. At 600 yards, the ballistic tables said a .50 caliber round had a measurable chance of striking a fast-moving target. Closer than that, the hit probability improved rapidly. Fire too early, instructors warned, and gunners would empty their belts without effect, overheat their barrels, and leave themselves defenseless when it mattered most. The logic was clean, elegant, scientific. It was also disconnected from reality, because the doctrine assumed something critical: that bomber gunners and attacking fighters entered combat at the same moment. They didn't. German pilots did not wait for American rules to allow a response. They attacked when it suited them, when they had speed, altitude, and initiative. By the time a fighter crossed into the approved firing range, cannon shells were already tearing through aluminum skin. The bomber absorbed damage first, always. Yet the rule remained unchanged. Losses mounted across the 8th Air Force. Entire crews vanished on missions that looked routine on briefing maps. Formations that appeared strong at takeoff returned fractured, if they returned at all. Still, the system insisted the problem lay elsewhere. Perhaps gunners needed more training. Perhaps formations needed adjustment. Perhaps discipline needed to be stricter. The rule itself was never questioned. This was not stubbornness. It was institutional momentum. The United States Army Air Forces had invested enormous resources into this doctrine. Hundreds of thousands of gunners had been trained to follow it. Instructors had taught it. Officers had signed off on it. Changing the rule would mean admitting that something fundamental had been wrong while men were dying. So instead, the system doubled down. Training emphasized deflection shooting. Lead angles were drilled relentlessly. Gunners were reminded that patience and discipline were their greatest weapons. Wait, track, fire only when the math says it will work. But air combat was not a shooting range. Inside a bomber at altitude, nothing was stable. The aircraft shook in turbulence. Oxygen systems failed. Frost crept into gloves and joints. Visibility came and went through cloud and smoke. The clean geometry of training manuals dissolved into chaos. And in chaos, the side that controls the timing controls the fight. German fighter pilots understood this instinctively. Their tactics revolved around initiating the engagement, forcing bombers to react. They attacked from angles that compressed reaction time. They fired first, broke away, regrouped, and attacked again. The doctrine that governed American gunners had unintentionally handed initiative to the enemy. Worse still, it taught crews to accept this as normal. Loss statistics reflected the cost. By mid-1943, bomber loss rates reached levels that threatened the entire air campaign. The math that once promised safety now predicted collapse. At existing loss rates, the bomber force could not sustain itself long enough to achieve its strategic goals. Yet even as the numbers grew grim, the rule remained untouched. Because rules, once embedded in institutions, acquire a dangerous quality. They begin to feel like facts. No one remembered who first decided that 400 yards was correct. No one could point to a single battle that proved it. The rule existed because it always had. Wartime systems, tradition can be as deadly as enemy fire. The tragedy of the doctrine was not that it failed. It was that it failed quietly. There was no dramatic moment when commanders declared it wrong. No single report that shattered belief. Instead, bombers kept falling. Crews kept dying. And the system explained it all away as the unavoidable cost of war. Until combat itself began to tell a different story. Not through theory, not through training, but through behavior that did not fit the rule. Small deviations, unapproved decisions, actions taken not because they were taught, but because survival demanded them. And once those deviations appeared, the logic holding the doctrine together began to crack. To understand why the rule was deadly, you have to forget the way combat was taught and look at the way combat actually happened. The doctrine assumed symmetry. It assumed that both sides entered the fight at the same time, under the same conditions, with the same freedom to act. That assumption was false. Air combat over Europe was asymmetric from the first second. German fighters chose when to engage. They chose their approach angle. They chose their speed, altitude, and timing. Bombers did not. Bombers flew straight, heavy with fuel and bombs, locked into formations that prioritized navigation and bombing accuracy over maneuver. Their defensive firepower was impressive, but only if it could be brought to bear in time. The rule that governed American gunners ignored this imbalance. It treated defense as a delayed reaction, not an active contest for control. In theory, waiting for optimal range maximized accuracy. In practice, waiting surrendered initiative. And initiative, in combat, is everything. When a fighter pilot attacks, the most dangerous moment is not when he fires, it is the seconds before he fires. That is when he must stabilize his aircraft, line up his shot, and commit to a predictable path. Those seconds are fragile. The doctrine never accounted for that. By forcing gunners to wait, it allowed attackers to reach their most dangerous phase uncontested. German pilots entered firing position already committed, already focused, already executing their plan. The bombers' response came too late. This is where the mathematics quietly betrayed the crews who trusted them. Ballistic tables measured hit probability. They did not measure disruption. They did not measure fear. They did not measure hesitation. They assumed the enemy would continue flying as planned. Humans do not behave that way. A fighter pilot flying into a bomber formation was not a number on a chart. He was a person balancing aggression against survival. He reacted to threats instantly and instinctively. Early defensive fire, even inaccurate fire, changed his calculations. But the doctrine dismissed that possibility entirely. From the perspective of training command, firing outside optimal range was wasteful. Ammunition was finite, barrels overheated. Logistics mattered. What they failed to consider was that bomber losses were also finite and irreplaceable. Every bomber destroyed was not just an aircraft. It was a crew trained over months. It was a mission aborted. It was a gap in the formation. Yet the doctrine treated ammunition conservation as a higher priority than psychological pressure. This imbalance shaped every engagement. German pilots learned that bombers would not fire early. They learned the windows of safety. They learned how long they could approach without consequence. That knowledge became part of their tactics. The rule that was supposed to protect American crews became predictable behavior the enemy could exploit. Predictability is fatal in combat. The doctrine also misunderstood what defensive fire was supposed to accomplish. It treated defense as a shooting problem, hit or miss. But defense is not about hits. It is about denying the enemy freedom of action. A fighter that breaks off early, hesitates, or misaligns, its attack may survive, but it fails its mission. And in air combat, failed attacks matter just as much as destroyed aircraft. The manuals never acknowledged this. They measured success in confirmed kills. They ignored prevented attacks. So when analysts reviewed gun camera footage, they saw low hit rates and concluded gunners were ineffective. What they did not see were the attacks that never fully materialized, the approaches disrupted before they became lethal. The doctrine was blind to absence, blind to what did not happen. This blindness shaped training priorities. Gunners were taught precision over pressure, discipline over aggression, restraint over initiative, all qualities that make sense in controlled environments. None that survive contact with an enemy who is already firing. The gap between theory and reality widened with every mission. Crews began to notice patterns the system could not explain. Fighters that pressed attacks aggressively when unchallenged. Fighters that scattered when fire appeared early. Attacks that dissolved when the bomber formation appeared alive sooner than expected. Observations did not fit doctrine, so they were ignored. Institutions tend to protect their assumptions. Admitting the rule was flawed would mean admitting that losses were not inevitable, that they were, at least in part, self-inflicted. That realization carried an unbearable implication. If the rule was wrong, then men had died following it. So the system looked away. But combat does not care what a system prefers to believe. The battlefield kept delivering the same verdict, mission after mission. Initiative decided survival. Timing outweighed accuracy. Psychology mattered more than probability. The doctrine had optimized for the wrong variable, and as long as that variable remained unchallenged, the air war would continue bleeding crews at an unsustainable rate. What finally forced change was not a revelation from above. It was pressure from below, from situations where waiting no longer made sense, from moments where following the rule meant certain destruction, from decisions made not to improve efficiency but simply to stay alive. Those decisions did not arrive as formal proposals. They arrived as actions, small, unapproved, often unreported. And once they began to appear, the neat logic holding the doctrine together could no longer explain what crews were experiencing in the sky. The rule had failed not because it was irrational, but because it misunderstood what combat actually was. And the moment that misunderstanding became impossible to ignore, the system faced a choice: change or continue sacrificing men to preserve a belief. Cracks did not appear in headquarters. They appeared in the air. They appeared in moments where doctrine offered no good option, only bad ones. Where following the rule meant accepting damage before a single shot could be fired. In those moments, crews stopped thinking like students and started thinking like survivors. No one announced a change. No orders were issued. No manuals were rewritten. Instead, something quieter happened. Some gunners began to fire earlier, not because they believed the textbooks were wrong, but because waiting no longer made sense. Because the enemy was already shooting. Because hesitation felt more dangerous than breaking a rule. These were not coordinated decisions. They were situational, instinctive, often unspoken. A gunner saw fighters forming up and squeezed the trigger sooner than he was taught. Another held fire slightly longer than regulation. A third ignored burst discipline and kept firing until the threat broke away. Each deviation was small. Each was technically incorrect, but together they marked the beginning of a shift. What made these actions different was not that they violated doctrine. Combat always produces violations. What mattered was the effect they produced. Enemy behavior began to change. Pilots who expected silent approaches suddenly flew into streams of tracers earlier than planned. Attack runs grew shorter. Formations loosened. Break-offs happened sooner. Nothing dramatic. Nothing easily measurable. But crews noticed. Bombers that should have taken damage didn't. Attacks that normally pressed home didn't. Moments that usually ended in explosions ended in separation. The system had no language for this. Doctrine categorized outcomes as hits or misses, kills or no kills, losses or survivals. It did not account for hesitation. So, when intelligence officers reviewed reports, the official metrics showed little improvement. Hit rates remained low. Ammunition expenditure increased. On paper, nothing looked better. Yet crews felt something had changed. This disconnect created tension. Gunnery instructors, removed from combat, saw only numbers. From their perspective, unauthorized firing appeared inefficient, even reckless. Ammunition usage rose without a corresponding spike in confirmed kills. To them, it looked like discipline was breaking down. But operational commanders saw something else. They saw aircraft coming home that should not have. They saw formations holding together longer. They saw pilots reporting less aggressive attacks. The difference lay in perspective. Training command evaluated performance in isolation. Combat units evaluated survival in context. This divergence mattered. For the first time, the doctrine was no longer universally trusted by those fighting under it. And that erosion of trust is always the beginning of institutional change. The unapproved behaviors spread, not through memos, but through conversation. Quiet exchanges between crews, comments over intercoms, observations shared in briefing rooms and mess halls. If you fire early, they hesitate. It's Drock. They don't press as hard. I goes the sex. They break sooner. You ever. No one framed it as a new theory. No one claimed certainty. It was simply something that seemed to work. The system resisted. Officially, the rule remained unchanged. Gunners were still expected to conserve ammunition, to wait for optimal range, to follow established procedures. Unofficially, reality was rewriting priorities. This created a dangerous gray zone. Crews were now navigating two sets of rules, the ones written in manuals and the ones enforced by survival. Such environments are unstable. Eventually, the contradictions surface. In this case, they surface through data not immediately, and not cleanly, but unmistakably. Operational reports began to show subtle patterns. Units where gunners fired more aggressively reported fewer successful enemy attack runs. Loss rates varied not by aircraft type or formation, but by behavior. The correlations were messy. Not every mission supported them. Not every aggressive gunner survived. But the trend refused to disappear. The doctrine specialists dismissed it as noise. Statistical variance, enemy fatigue, coincidence. Combat commanders disagreed. They did not need perfect certainty. They needed improvement. This was the point where the system faced a familiar dilemma: protect consistency or adapt to evidence. For large institutions, consistency feels safer. It preserves authority. It avoids admitting error. It keeps responsibility diffuse. Adaptation, by contrast, implies that previous assumptions were wrong, and that people paid for those assumptions with their lives. The system hesitated. But combat does not wait for institutions to resolve internal debates. The air war intensified. Missions grew deeper. Opposition stiffened. Losses threatened strategic timelines. Pressure mounted. And under pressure, rules lose their power. Commanders began to tolerate deviations they would previously have punished. Reports that once would have triggered reprimands were quietly set aside. Instructors were told to observe, not interfere. The system had not officially changed, but it had stopped enforcing its own rigidity. That moment mattered more than any written order. Because once enforcement weakens, experimentation accelerates. Crews refined what they were already doing. They learned when early fire mattered and when it did not. They adapted to circumstances instead of adhering blindly to distance markers. The doctrine had been built to eliminate judgment. Combat demanded it. This was the real break, not the introduction of a new tactic, not the validation of a specific individual, but the collapse of unquestioned obedience to a flawed assumption. The belief that precision alone guaranteed survival was dying. In its place emerged a harder truth, that combat effectiveness depended on forcing the enemy to react, not waiting to respond. The system had not yet admitted this openly, but it was already behaving as if it were true. And once behavior changes, Doctrine always follows. The question was no longer whether the rule was perfect. The question was how long the system could afford to pretend it was. Institutions rarely change because they are persuaded. They change because denial becomes impossible. By late summer of 1943, that moment was approaching. The deviations that began as isolated acts of survival had accumulated into patterns. Not neat, not universally accepted, but persistent enough to attract attention beyond individual crews. After-action reports grew thicker. Debriefings grew longer. And the questions being asked quietly shifted. Not why are gunners firing early, but why do some formations lose fewer aircraft than others? This was a dangerous question, because once commanders began comparing outcomes instead of procedures, the rule's authority weakened. Analysts started doing what institutions do best when faced with confusion: counting. They compared missions flown under similar conditions. Same routes, same opposition, same weather, same aircraft. The only meaningful variable was behavior. Some formations engaged aggressively. Others followed the manual precisely. The difference showed up where the system had not been trained to look. Losses. The numbers did not explode into clarity. They never do. War data is messy, incomplete, and contaminated by chance. But the signal was there. Formations where defensive fire appeared earlier suffered fewer successful attack runs. Enemy pilots disengaged sooner. Attacks grew less coordinated. None of this guaranteed safety. Bombers still fell. Crews still died. But the trend was unmistakable. The doctrine that had promised certainty delivered fragility. The behavior that violated it delivered resilience. This created a crisis of interpretation. Training command evaluated performance by compliance. Operational command evaluated performance by survival. Both sides used numbers. They just asked different questions. To the instructors, increased ammunition expenditure without proportional kill claims looked like inefficiency. To the men responsible for missions and crews, fewer missing aircraft looked like progress. These perspectives collided. Meetings grew tense. Language grew careful. No one wanted to accuse the system of failure directly. Instead, the debate hid behind terms like anomalies, context, and operational variance. It was a piecer, but the underlying issue was simple. The doctrine had optimized for the wrong outcome. It had prioritized conserving resources over denying initiative, precision over pressure, control over disruption. Combat had revealed that these priorities were backward. Still, institutions resist admitting such reversals. Changing doctrine means rewriting training. Rewriting training means admitting error. Admitting error means accepting responsibility. That kind of accountability does not come easily. So the system searched for compromise. New language began to appear in guidance. Carefully phrased. Ambiguous. Phrases like, when tactically appropriate. It bathed the culinary, based on the judgment of the gunner. ASB. Situational discretion. 1. These words mattered. They did not overturn the rule. They softened it, and that softening was enough. Once discretion was officially tolerated, enforcement dissolved. Gunners were no longer punished for acting early. Commanders were no longer required to correct them. The rule still existed, but it no longer controlled behavior. That is how systems change in reality. Not through dramatic announcements, but through the quiet removal of consequences. As this tolerance spread, experimentation accelerated. Crews refined timing. They learned how early was early enough. They learned when sustained fire mattered and when short bursts sufficed. This knowledge did not come from manuals. It came from experience. The results compounded. Enemy pilots adapted, but not perfectly. Aggressive defensive fire disrupted coordination. It increased hesitation. It punished inexperienced attackers. Veteran pilots pressed harder, but took greater risks doing so. Loss rates began to bend. Not collapse, not vanish, but bend. And bending was enough to change strategic calculations. For the first time since the bombing campaign began, planners could see a path forward that did not involve replacing the entire bomber force through attrition. This mattered far beyond individual missions. Strategic bombing was not just a tactic, It was a promise that air power could achieve results without ground invasions, without endless casualties. The promise had been close to breaking. The realization that doctrine, not enemy superiority, had driven losses forced a reassessment at the highest levels. Not everyone agreed. Some officers argued that the change coincided with other factors: improved formations, better intelligence, gradual attrition of enemy pilots. All of these played roles, but none explained the timing. The shift began before escorts dominated the skies, before new aircraft arrived in numbers, before enemy defenses collapsed. It began when defensive behavior changed. That distinction mattered. It meant the system had been hurting itself. And once that possibility was acknowledged, even indirectly, the old certainty could not be restored. Revised training materials followed slowly. Not rewritten from scratch, but amended. Examples updated. Emphasis adjusted. The doctrine did not announce its own failure. It simply stopped insisting it was right. This was the true turning point. Not a hero's achievement, not a single innovation, but the moment when data outweighed tradition, when survival forced humility, when the system learned reluctantly that combat does not reward correctness on paper. It rewards control. By the time the changes were formalized, many crews had already internalized the lesson. They no longer thought in terms of distance alone. They thought in terms of pressure. They no longer waited for permission to react. They acted to deny the enemy the comfort of timing. The rule had not been abolished. It had been subordinated to reality. And that shift, subtle, uncelebrated, and deeply uncomfortable, changed the trajectory of the air war. Because once initiative returned to the bombers, everything else became possible. X did not arrive as a dramatic victory. There was no single mission where losses suddenly vanished. No moment when the skies became safe. What changed was something more subtle and far more important. The balance of control shifted. Once defensive fire began earlier, the air war stopped being a one-sided sequence of attacks and reactions. It became a contest over timing. That shift altered everything. German fighter pilots had built their tactics around predictability. They knew when bombers would fire. They knew how long they could approach without consequence. They knew when commitment was required and when disengagement was safe. That knowledge evaporated. Early defensive fire forced pilots to make decisions sooner, often with incomplete information. Attacks that once unfolded methodically now began under pressure. Formation discipline eroded. Coordination suffered. The bomber stream no longer felt passive. This mattered even when no aircraft were shot down. A disrupted attack was still a failed attack. A broken approach was still a mission denied. The system had finally aligned with a truth it had long ignored. Defensive success is not measured by destruction alone, but by prevention. Loss rates reflected this change. Not instantly, not uniformly, but measurably. Fewer bombers failed to return. More crews completed missions intact. The statistical curve began to bend downward. That bend carried enormous implications. Strategic bombing depended on continuity. Aircraft could be replaced, but experienced crews could not. Each mission survived, preserved knowledge, confidence, and cohesion. Survival compounded. As crews returned, their experience fed back into the system. New gunners learned not just procedures, but judgment. They learned to read enemy behavior, not just distance markers. Doctrine began to absorb these lessons, quietly reframing its priorities. The manuals still spoke of optimal range. They still taught deflection and burst discipline. But beneath the language, emphasis shifted. Initiative mattered. Pressure mattered. Psychological disruption mattered. This was not an abandonment of mathematics. It was an expansion of it. The system learned to account for variables it had once dismissed as unquantifiable. Fear, hesitation, reaction time. These factors did not appear neatly in tables, but they appeared in outcomes. Enemy reports reflected the same change from the opposite side. Attacks were described as more dangerous. Approaches required greater resolve. Inexperienced pilots hesitated. Veterans pressed on, but at higher risk. The sky became less forgiving. This did not eliminate German resistance. It did not remove the need for escorts, improved aircraft, or broader strategic shifts. but it bought time. Time for long-range fighters to arrive in numbers. Time for formations to evolve. Time for the air campaign to survive long enough to matter. Without that margin, later advantages might never have materialized. This is where the true consequence becomes clear. The change did not win the air war by itself. It prevented the air war from collapsing before other factors could take effect. That distinction is often missed. History tends to celebrate decisive moments, but wars are more often shaped by avoided disasters. The old doctrine had pushed the bombing campaign toward a breaking point. The revised behavior pulled it back just far enough. That narrow margin mattered. It allowed planners to maintain pressure. It allowed crews to build confidence instead of fatalism. It restored a sense that survival was influenced by choice, not chance. That psychological shift within the bomber force was profound. Crews who believe they are helpless behave differently than crews who believe their actions matter. Morale is not a slogan, it is a tactical variable. Once gunners felt they could influence the fight, their posture changed. They became active participants rather than passengers waiting to be attacked. The bomber stream became more resilient, not because it was invulnerable, but because it was adaptive. This adaptability extended beyond gunnery. The same principle: engage early. Force reaction began to appear elsewhere. Escort tactics evolved. Defensive formations adjusted. Commanders became more receptive to field-driven change. The system had learned a painful lesson. Doctrine is useless, but that doctrine without humility is lethal. Rules designed to eliminate judgment had nearly destroyed the very force they were meant to protect. The consequence of changing them was not perfection. It was survivability, and survivability was enough. By the time air superiority tilted decisively in favor of the Allies, the earlier crisis had faded from memory. New aircraft and escorts claimed credit, and rightly so. But beneath those visible changes lay a quieter transformation. The understanding that control of timing, not just firepower, decides outcomes. That insight did not vanish with the war. It reappeared in later conflicts, in different forms: early warning systems, layered defenses, engagement at maximum range, not for immediate destruction, but for disruption. The principle endured because it was not tied to a specific weapon or era. It was tied to human behavior under threat. The air war over Europe had exposed a truth that extends far beyond it. Systems fail not because they lack intelligence, but because they mistake certainty for correctness. The consequence of challenging that mistake was not glory, it was survival. And survival, multiplied across thousands of crews, quietly reshaped the course of the war. By the time the air war stabilized, most people believed they understood what had happened. Better aircraft, better escorts, better coordination. Those explanations were convenient. They were also incomplete. What truly changed was not technology. It was how the system understood control. For years, Doctrine had treated combat as an optimization problem. If enough variables were measured and regulated, outcomes would improve. The role of the individual was to execute instructions precisely, not to interpret reality. That approach works in predictable environments. War is not one of them. The bombing campaign over Europe revealed a fundamental truth that institutions rarely like to confront. Systems designed to eliminate human judgment often fail precisely because they eliminate it. The original doctrine was not irrational. It was built by intelligent people using the best data available at the time. Its failure did not come from stupidity or negligence. It came from overconfidence. The belief that combat could be reduced to rules without losing something essential. What was lost was initiative. Rules that prioritize correctness over responsiveness create a dangerous delay. They slow reaction at the exact moment speed matters most. In the air, that delay translated into damage absorbed before defense began. Once that delay was removed, even partially, the entire dynamic shifted. This is the lesson that rarely appears in official histories. Not that aggression is always superior. Not that discipline is unnecessary. But that rigidity is fatal when conditions change faster than rules can adapt. The moment discretion was allowed back into the system, learning accelerated. Crews adjusted in real time. They refined behavior based on outcomes, not theory. That feedback loop is what saved the campaign. And it exposes a deeper insight about how large systems survive crisis. They do not do so by enforcing perfect compliance. They survive by tolerating deviation long enough for reality to reveal what works. The uncomfortable implication is this: many of the men lost early in the campaign did not die because the enemy was unbeatable. They died because the system refused to listen. That realization explains why institutional change is so difficult in wartime. Admitting a flawed assumption does not just alter tactics, it forces a moral reckoning. It raises questions no organization wants to answer. Who approved the rule? Who enforced it? Who benefited from believing it was correct? These questions rarely produce clean answers. So instead, systems prefer gradual drift, quiet adjustments, language that allows change without confession. This pattern repeated itself far beyond bomber gunnery. Throughout modern warfare, similar shifts have occurred again and again. Early warning systems that engage before threats fully materialize. Layered defenses designed to disrupt rather than destroy. Doctrines that prioritize reaction speed over perfect accuracy. Each reflects the same core realization. Control is about forcing the enemy to respond to you, not waiting for the ideal moment to act. The bombing campaign over Europe did not invent this principle, but it paid for it in blood. That cost explains why the lesson endured, not because it was elegant, but because it was expensive. What makes this story unsettling is how easily it generalizes. The same failure mode appears wherever complex systems operate under pressure. When rules replace judgment, when compliance replaces understanding, when institutions confuse consistency with effectiveness. The sky over Europe in 1943 was just one place where this conflict became visible. The difference between collapse and survival was not a breakthrough weapon. It was the willingness forced, reluctant, incomplete, to let reality override belief. Once that happened, outcomes changed. Not immediately, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to keep the campaign alive. Enough to preserve crews until other advantages emerged. Enough to alter the trajectory of the war without ever announcing itself as a turning point. That is why this story matters. Not because it celebrates ingenuity, not because it condemns authority, but because it shows how easily systems mistake certainty for truth and how costly that mistake can be. The air war did not turn when someone proved the old rule wrong on paper. It turned when the system stopped insisting it was right. That distinction matters far beyond history, because every system, in every era, eventually faces the same choice: protect the rule or adapt to reality. And when that moment arrives, the cost of delay is always paid by the people closest to the problem. At the end of the war, few people remembered how close the air campaign had come to breaking. New aircraft dominated the headlines. Escort fighters took center stage. Victory rewrote memory. The earlier crisis faded into the background, absorbed into a broader narrative of inevitable success. That is how legacies usually work. They are shaped not by what almost failed, but by what eventually prevailed. Yet beneath the visible achievements, something quieter endured. A change in how the system understood itself. After 1943, bomber defense was no longer treated as a passive calculation. It was understood as an active contest over timing, pressure, and perception. Manuals reflected this indirectly. Training emphasized judgment alongside procedure. No single paragraph declared the old assumption dead. It simply stopped guiding behavior. This quiet disappearance is important, because the most influential changes in large systems rarely announce themselves. They survive by blending into normality, by becoming how things are done, rather than what was learned. The principle carried forward. In later conflicts, defensive systems were designed to engage threats earlier, not to guarantee destruction, but to deny freedom of action. Radar networks, layered defenses, and early interception all echoed the same logic. Force the enemy to react. Disrupt before precision matters. Control the tempo. These ideas did not originate in the skies over Europe, but they were confirmed there under conditions where error carried an immediate price. That price ensured the lesson was not forgotten. What makes this legacy uncomfortable is that it lacks a clear hero. There was no single inventor, No official doctrine revision credited to a name. No moment of revelation captured in photographs. The change emerged from friction between reality and belief, from pressure applied to a system until it yielded. That kind of legacy resists celebration. It does not fit neatly into medals or monuments. It cannot be reduced to a speech or a date, but it shapes outcomes all the same. The deeper lesson of this story is not about courage under fire, though courage was present. It is about humility under uncertainty, about the danger of assuming that a rule, once written, remains correct simply because it is enforced. The men who survived the air war did not do so because the system was flawless. They survived because, eventually, the system stopped insisting that it was. That distinction matters, because every organization facing complexity is tempted to do the opposite, to treat rules as shields, to confuse obedience with effectiveness, to protect assumptions instead of testing them. The skies over Europe exposed the cost of that temptation. They also showed that adaptation does not require perfection. It requires permission. Permission to act when reality demands it. Permission to deviate when the rule no longer fits. Permission to acknowledge that survival sometimes depends on breaking what everyone else believes is correct. This is why the legacy of that change extends beyond World War II. It is not a lesson about aircraft or weapons. It is a lesson about systems under pressure, about how knowledge evolves not through certainty, but through friction, about how progress often begins not with discovery but with doubt. In 1943, that doubt arrived too late for many, but it arrived in time to prevent something worse. And that, more than any single victory, shaped what followed. Because the wars that are won are not always decided by the weapons that dominate the battlefield, but by the assumptions that quietly stop killing the people meant to use them. This documentary changed how you see the air war in World War II. Consider subscribing. We focus on the hidden decisions, quiet failures, and systemic forces that history often overlooks. Because the most important lessons of war are rarely the loudest ones.